Hi everyone, and welcome back. We are joined today again by Colonel Douglas Macgregor, the former advisor to the U.S. Secretary of Defense, also a decorated combat veteran, a PhD, and also author of several books on war strategy. So yes, always great to have you back.
Sure. Good to be with you, Glenn.
So before we get into the recent diplomatic developments between the United States and Russia, I was wondering how you interpret what's happening in Ukraine in terms of the war and yeah, specifically in terms of the front lines and military capability which yeah, persists in Ukraine.
Strategically, I can't add too much to what Viktor Orban has said. And he's been very straightforward and said Ukraine has lost the war. And that's true. The Ukrainian war against Russia, which is a proxy war on the part of Washington against Russia, is lost. And if we look at current events, it's deplorable. The Russians are now advancing in a number of areas. Obviously, there are still some battles of encirclement going on where you have pockets of modest resistance left. But the bottom line is they're advancing because there isn't much Ukrainian resistance because most of the Ukrainian troops are dead. And the ones that are showing up, we know, with a few exceptions, involve a lot of old men and boys. So Ukraine is on its last legs, which is, I think, why Zelensky is running all over Europe right now, trying desperately to find somebody to provide money and equipment that will somehow or another convey the illusion that there is still a Ukrainian state that has teeth. I don't think there is. So what I see now happening is the Russians are going to move forward to the west. I don't see any reason why they would stop at this point. I think they'll move towards Zaporozhye because you've got the bridges there over the Dnieper, which create the opportunity for the Russians, if they decide to do it, to cross. They could head south to Odessa. They could head north to Kiev, in either case. Further north, you have some other penetrations, but let's face it, when they encounter the Ukrainians, their resistance is weak, and the fortifications, in many cases, are no longer manned because there just aren't any Ukrainian troops to man them. So I think from a purely military standpoint, this war is over. There's no question about that at all. The Russians are now deciding to what extent their goals are being met. And I think they're having a meeting with us in Alaska as a courtesy to Donald Trump more than anything else, not because there's any necessity on their part or need for it.
And how do you read the recent developments that is north of Pokrovsk? Because the Russians suddenly just pushed through, I think it was so 12, 15 kilometers and through what was supposed to be a defended region. And they seemed to push just straight through, and suddenly, again, there's been encirclements in the past, but now the entirety of the city of Pokrovsk and Mironograd being captured in one big cauldron. This is yeah, unusual. I was wondering how you well, how you explain this. Is this a collapse? Are we nearing a collapse? And what is the significance of these massive breakthroughs?
Well, I think we're in the middle of the collapse right now. The Ukrainian military establishment is incapable of doing a great deal any longer. They don't have any major reserves that they can throw into the breach. And I think now, especially with their Azov units, they're husbanding those, even though those are largely Ministry of Interior units. They're holding them back, I think, to protect themselves, that is the regime, and hopefully keep it in power in Kiev. What you described is interesting because these were to be the so-called fortress cities that would be defended bitterly against the Russians. It's very reminiscent, frankly, of 1944, June and July, when Hitler declared certain states, or not states, but cities, Mogilev and others, as fortress places that would be defended to the bitter end. And it was simply impossible to do so. And a lot of people simply disobeyed his orders because they'd been defending every inch of ground for the previous year and a half to 2 years. It was a waste of time. I think that same sort of mentality has set in with the Ukrainians. And right now, many Ukrainian troops are just hopefully getting out of the way because they can't stop it. And you ask yourself, if you're a Ukrainian soldier at this point, the war is obviously lost. We have nothing to throw into the battle. So why should I sacrifice my life? What difference will it make to the outcome? I think that's the mentality that's taking hold in Ukraine. And even the most pro-Ukrainian channels are admitting to the disaster if you listen to them carefully. So I think I think this is sinking in. The question again is, President Putin and his colleagues in this inner circle that is running things, they have specific goals and objectives. How many of those have been reached and how many not? It's hard for me to judge sitting where I am. I think the plan or desire or goal to annihilate the Ukrainian military establishment is largely achieved. But then you have these problems. You have the Germans, of course, who stand up and say, well, we'll provide Taurus missiles. Well, this is outrageous nonsense. That's like, you've got a wounded, exhausted soldier. He's the last man on the field. And you hand him this flamethrower and say, go at it, do the best you can. It's not going to make any difference to the outcome of the war, but it makes the people in Kiev, happy because it creates the illusion there's something left. And it also makes the globalists and neocons who are running Europe happy because they think they're still harming Russia. It's all nonsense. And I think President Putin has tried very hard to make it clear to the Germans that if they provide these Taurus missiles, they're launched from Ukraine against Moscow or St. Petersburg or anywhere else, that they will treat Germany as a co-belligerent and they will attack Germany. How, when, and where, and what, that's another matter. I hope the Germans are listening because I think the Russians are quite serious.
Well, we've spoken a lot over the past 3 years about this, and you pretty much said from day one that this war was being won by Russia, even at the same time when all the media headlines were telling us that Ukraine was winning, they're winning, Putin's gonna die in his bunker, talking about how to divide up Russia, what to do after the defeat of Russia, how bad should we humiliate Russia? I mean, again, given that you're one of the people who saw this coming from the beginning, why do you think the West misjudged Russia, and what mistakes have been done on our side, that is the NATO and Ukraine side?
Well, I think we have to understand that there really is no strategy on the Western side. There is a wish list. And the people in charge had decided, or decided early on in Western Europe and in the United States, that Russia presented a threat to globalism, a threat to their plans for Europe and their plans here in the United States. The same people that want the borders open and have invited millions of non-Europeans into the Western world for the purpose of essentially destroying what I would call the core populations of Europe and the United States, they're the ones that want desperately to destroy Russia. It's a very interesting connection. Now, I think it's failed. It's winding down in terms of the war with Russia. But why Russia? Well, Russia was this tasty morsel that everyone had wanted to consume back in the 1990s. When things fell apart, everyone poured in. When I say everyone, who are we talking about? Well, we talk about the financial capitalists, the people that make money through transaction fees by buying up things, dismantling them, and selling them off. People like this man Browder, who is very prominent in his criticism of President Putin. President Putin emerges at a very important point in the history of Russia, because up until that point, Russia was essentially defenseless, naked, in the face of all of these people determined to destroy it. And when I say destroy, I mean break it up. Take whatever there is of value, using any lever that they had, whether it was organized crime or direct influence from states. The idea was you break it up and you steal the 40 trillion plus resources. And whatever is left over, you set up a puppet regime. You install somebody, just as we installed the regime in Kiev in 2014 and have subsequently installed other leaders. That was the plan for Russia. We'll do to Russia what we've done to Ukraine. And Ukraine was simply a useful tool, that's all. Well, that's all failed now. That's not going to happen. But we in the West, in Western Europe, in the United States, we're stuck with the tens of millions of people that were introduced into our countries that we didn't ask for, that we didn't want, and we can't employ, and we can't pay for. So what is going to happen? I think the whole shift is going to be away from Russia at some point, and it's all going to become internal. And when that occurs, all these governments, Merz's government, Macron, Starmer, everyone, they'll all be swept away, which needs to happen. I think to some extent, President Putin has exercised restraint and patience because he's awaiting this development. I mean, he's not foolish or stupid. He knows what's going on in the West. He's one of the few in Moscow that has a real appreciation and understanding for what's happening in the West. So he's probably counseled people privately, look, let's stand by. Don't be excited. Don't try to launch any major offenses. We'll grind forward. We'll attrit this army until it doesn't exist, and then we'll take whatever we think we have to secure Russia. And again, he's never been interested in governing non-Russians. I mean, that's one of the things that nobody seems to get because of the media and the lies that everybody tells at the top of the political structures. There's no interest in going into Europe. He doesn't want to rule any Western Ukrainians. I mean, that would be a headache on a scale that we can't even begin to imagine. He knows that, doesn't want anything to do with it. He's been looking for people that are willing to step up and say, look, this war is over. You get to keep what you've won, which is Russian anyway. Now it's up to us to deal with the Ukrainians. He's been hoping that that would happen in Warsaw, in Berlin, in Bratislava, in Budapest. It hasn't happened yet, but I think we're getting closer. But the reason it hasn't happened is because of us. And I think people are beginning to figure out that what kind of staying power do we have? Our financial system is very fragile. We can't sell our debt. We've failed miserably in the bond market. Now we're turning to treasury bills and turning over the investments in every 4 to 6 weeks because we can't get anybody to invest in 10 years or 2 years. Nobody wants to buy it anymore. At some point, this locomotive, this debt-financed consumption model that we've used, which has led us to a $37 trillion national sovereign debt. Beyond that, there are probably another 10 to 20 trillion in debt in other places that Americans don't even know or appreciate. The fact of the matter is that we're nearing the end, and I think there's a sense that we're nearing the end of this debt-financed consumption system. And I think Putin has waited for this to happen. He's done everything he can, along with the rest of the world, to essentially shed debt. BRICS is all about offloading American and Western debt and being debt-free. It's about changing the whole monetary system to something that has real value. Currency, it's backed by something real, gold, maybe other precious metals too. But the point is, everyone is trying to distance themselves from us. We are what we call patient zero, the original carrier of the plague. What's the plague? Well, the plague is the dollar. The dollar is poison. It's how we pass on our debt to people. So what are people doing? They are de-dollarizing. They're getting out from under it. What I'm trying to say is that we should understand the reality of where we are in the West, which no one wants to address. But I think President Putin understands that reality. I know that Xi does. And I know that Tokyo and Seoul have figured this out. And if you go to Northeast Asia and you talk to people there, they're simply waiting for us to leave because they know we can't afford to stay much longer. I think that's going to happen in Europe as well. But in the meantime, what do we get from Washington? Well, we get this political theater. We want to maintain the fiction that we are still today what we were 30 years ago, that nothing has really changed. That's not going to work much longer. So I think in the final analysis, President Trump, when he goes to Alaska to meet with President Putin, is going to be polite. I think they'll both be polite to each other. And I think President Putin will make his position clear, which has not changed in a very long time. President Trump will listen. Does he completely understand what he's listening to? I don't know. I sometimes get the impression that the people that surround President Trump have a vested interest in keeping him uninformed, so that he stands up from time to time and says, oh, the Russians are taking terrible losses, and I know Putin wants to end this war. Well, of course he wants to end the war, but he's not taking heavy losses. You know, they were in double-digit losses every day. In other words, killed in action. In January and February, March, it was like 25, 30, 40, 50, 60 Russians a day. You know what it is now? It's single digit. It's single digit. The losses on the Ukrainian side, as you would expect at the end of a war when things are collapsing, are horrific. So it's a matter of plowing ahead, reaching the Dnieper River. But when you get there, the question you have to ask is, okay, we've come this far. We've achieved the goal of destroying the Ukrainian force, but we still have this facade of a government sitting in Kiev. We still don't have anyone to talk to, really. We have this man Trump, but what can he deliver? You know, if you're looking for something like the Austrian State Treaty, that took a long time to negotiate. The Austrians were heavily engaged. They wanted to be neutral. They wanted to be out of harm's way. Eisenhower at the time said, thank God, we can't defend all these countries against the Soviets. And the Soviets were happy to get out because they didn't see any real purpose in being there strategically. Austria didn't offer them anything. So at the end of the day, it worked. Everybody signed up. The guarantees were made. If you're President Putin, where's that going to occur? Who's going to do that? So when he goes to meet with President Trump, I think he'll be very polite, but I don't think he has any confidence that President Trump can deliver on anything. How many times have we heard President Putin tell everyone, I have known several presidents. All of them seemed like they were good people and they wanted to do things differently. And what happened? They all ended up doing the same thing. And that's what's happened with President Trump. So there is no real strategy other than to keep on doing what we've been doing since the early 90s. That's it. So you have new bases showing up in Scandinavia. For what? To do what? Against whom? It's crazy. So instead of 840 bases overseas, I guess we now have close to 900. And again, the question is, for what? Against whom? But this is a sort of the system is going to run until it can't. And we're approaching entropy, but the world hasn't seen it yet. And so the American brand is still very strong. But at some point, entropy is going to set in, and sooner rather than later. I think the next 60 to 90 days are going to be very volatile here in the United States, financially and economically. And I think President Trump knows that. Look, President Trump has sent forces into Washington. Washington as a national capital has been a disgrace for decades. He wants to end that, wants to clean it up. He wants it to be a safe place to walk. Every time I travel into or out of Dulles Airport, I inevitably run into friends from Germany or other parts in Europe, and they all talk to me and say, my God, why aren't you doing something about your capital? And they're right. We need to. The British have a similar problem. So do the people in Berlin, and so do the French in Paris. We all do. He has now stepped forward, and he's going to do something about it. He's also talked about establishing a quick reaction force to deal with internal unrest inside the United States. So in that sense, I think President Trump knows the weakness behind the facade here at home, the lack of social cohesion, the breakdown of law and order. I think he knows, even though he says, oh, we've stopped everything from coming in illegally. In truth, that's not true. We've stopped the masses. But the human trafficking, the drug trafficking, that continues. It continues to the legal ports of entry because the cartels have bought off all the customs police and so forth. But he at least knows that we are in dire trouble here at home in the United States. So what is he going to do when he finishes this meeting? What's he going to come out and say? I have promised to guarantee neutrality for Ukraine. I promise the Russians will double down and support that. I've said that I'm going to deliver NATO on this question. Right now, is NATO really listening to Donald Trump? Who is in NATO? It's a herd of cats. How many of those cats want to march east and fight the great war against Russia? Not very many, if any at all. So what can President Trump deliver? I think Putin knows not a great deal. And I think President Trump knows he can't do much. So I think his inclination, Glenn, is going to be, look, I've got to find a way to wash my hands of this. It's not working. There's not much I can do about it. This war's being won. Now, will he say that publicly? I don't know. But in his mind, he says, now I'm going to focus on the Middle East. But the truth is, what's happening in the Caucasus with Azerbaijan, what's happening with the corridor that runs through eastern Syria all the way up to Turkey and to Azerbaijan, as well as what's happening in southern Syria and the destruction, the subjugation of Gaza, the West Bank, and all this other business. It's all part and parcel of the same thing. The same people are pushing those objectives and those goals have been pushing the war against Russia. And in their minds, if they can make Azerbaijan a platform for attack against Iran, which is what they want, it also has the bonus virtue of harming Russia. So the same underlying forces in what we like to call the deep state, which is not really that deep at all. It's all about oligarchic billionaires who are pursuing these things. I think he's going to try and do something in the Middle East. I don't think he's going to have much effect. Again, I think he's a prisoner of the people around him and the drive of the state in a particular direction that he doesn't seem to be able to alter.
But on this determination, though, to continue to go after Russia, even now that we see that the war has been lost, how do you explain still the wider, I guess, NATO strategy? I mean, you know these people. You had a central role in the strategic planning from Kosovo to Iraq. Well, what are these people in private after because all strategic documents are kind of whitewashed a bit. But what do these people talk about in terms of what they expect from Russia? More of a wider view. What is Russia's position in the world versus ours? What is essentially behind this idea of what kind of relationship we should have with the Russians?
Well, they're part of an ideological wave that sees everything that is not under their control. And I'm talking now about control in the sense of the globalists, states that have a strong national identity, states that have decided, as Hungary has, I think the Poles and others, no, we're going to be Polish. We're going to be Hungarian. We're going to be whatever we are. We're not going to be a polyglot nation that is mired in wokeness and is committed to suicide on the national level. In other words, these globalists, that's what they want. They want that for Russia. They simply want to extend the disease that is killing the West to Russia, to China, to anybody, anywhere, because they think ideologically they're right. They think they're the future. In reality, they're very much the past. The lesson of history is, I'm sorry, but nations are very strong. The people that live in them are real. These gene pools are not irrelevant. They mean something. The culture that they created, the civilization they created and maintained, all of these things are real. They're not artificial constructs. The artificial construct is globalism. That's where we are right now. So, and when you talk to these people in private, it's a venture into fantasy land. We're going to create this utopia where everyone lives together, and they love each other, and they're going to work together, and that's the way it must be. I had this argument many years ago in I guess it was 1995, when I went back to Ohio for the Dayton Accords. I had to go there, and I was engaged to draw maps, which was fruitless because every time we would draw a boundary, one of the participants, Izabegovich or someone else, would come in and say, oh, no, we have to have that village. That village has to be here or something. So it wasn't a very fruitful enterprise. But the thing that I heard over and over and over again was, These people must learn to live together. This is the new Europe. This is the future. Everything is integrated. And then I said, but, the Serbs, the Croats, they don't want that. They want to live in their own countries. They're all the same. They all speak the same language. There's no difference between them. And I said, well, they think there is, and there's a lot of evidence that they're right. There is. And I must tell you that some of your countrymen were among the worst offenders. And I finally got tired of dealing with one Norwegian, and I told him straight up, I said, well, then let's take down the border between Norway and Sweden. What's the difference between Norwegians and Swedes and Danes? Why aren't you all living in the same civilizational construct? And of course, well, that's different. No, it's not different. Norway exists because there are people that call themselves Norwegians. They have a culture, a language, a history, a purpose. Well, so do the Serbs, so do the Croats, and so do the Bosniaks. So don't sit here and tell me none of this matters. But those people, and those are the forerunners of people like Tony Blinken, and the forerunners of virtually all the what I would call the sort of crazies that live in Washington, D.C., who live in Never Never Land, where, everything's woke and everyone's happy and loves each other. And, our own countries right now are divided along racial, cultural, economic lines. I mean, this is not one big, long, unending party. This has been a catastrophe. And I try to remind people, they say, well, what happens if things break down? I said, well, Lenin said every nation, every state, every government is 3 meals away from a revolution. He was right. When that breaks down, all hell breaks loose. And that's when everybody says, wait a minute, what are you doing in my country? You're not me. Why are you drawing all this money? I mean, Germany's got a real problem right now because I think the Germans have just bent over backwards to pay out incredible sums of money to all of these people that have shown up in the country that nobody there wants. And by the way, they're living infinitely better and drawing more pay than the Germans themselves. So these are huge problems that are coming. And to go back to Putin, I think Putin gets it. I think he knows this is coming. Just as Xi and company, they look at us and they say this thing is falling apart. I think privately, President Trump is concerned about this, which is why he's adopting the measures he is here at home. But in the meantime, overseas, he doesn't seem to have much control. I think the CIA, the State Department, senior military leadership, there's a cabal in Washington that all have an interest in ensuring nothing changes and that we continue to go down this path. I don't think he can do much about it.
I feel like we watched this movie before. That is, in the 19th century, it was the same thing. You had the globalization kicking in with the railways, new industries, people crossing borders. Everyone started talking the same language of, post-national states. And then, once over time, it began to exhaust itself by reducing the internal cohesions. And once the globalization and the economy began to slow down, especially after 1873, suddenly this is when everything began to fall a bit apart, and the people realized that the energy had been exhausted and the consequences which hadn't been addressed was building up. And it's it's so it does sound awfully familiar.
Well, I think, you could make the argument that we here in the United States, along with the West European states, have all become some version of Austria-Hungary. Now, what we don't understand is why Austria-Hungary held together for so long. Remember, it was the Austrian Empire, then eventually became Austria-Hungary after 1866. But what held it together? It was called the Habsburg Crown. What holds us together? That's the question. And that's a question very few people in the United States can answer easily. And I think it's a serious problem. This is what this disease called globalism has done to us. It hasn't just confused us about gender. How many genders are there? I've heard people, there are at least 7 or 8 genders. Really? Not in the real world. That's insane. All the things that we took for granted as true and productive and healthy have been thrown out. And so you have internal chaos, people questioning themselves, questioning the institutions, questioning their governments. But everyone is afraid to step forward for fear that if you toss the people out of power, who comes in? I mean, if there's one thing that we really have a problem with, and this is not unique to us, but it's a huge problem for the United States, and I think in much of Western Europe, is that we call it the bench, the talent bench, is very shallow. Because anyone who stood up and had the temerity to disagree was edged out. So if someone stood up and said in Norway, look, Norwegians for Norway, Norway first, how would that go down? Oh, that's bad. Really? Why is that bad? Well, that you have to understand we can't do that. I mean, this is what's being built into people. It's demented. It's going to go away. But like everything else, it's going to get worse before it gets better. And all of this is bound up with this war in Ukraine. If we can bring down Putin, as though Putin as an individual is Russia, Putin leads Russia, and he is strongly supported, as you know, if you look at any of the legitimate polling data. But removing him isn't going to change much. Russia will remain Russia. And that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. And we need to stop looking at any state that has a true national identity and culture and language as bad. But that's what we've been doing. And here in the United States, we used to insist on Americanization, assimilation. That's gone. We now allow people from various places to come in, set up independent countries right on our soil. They want their own laws. They want to take over whole cities. I mean, this is insane. This is the path to disintegration. So at some point, the pendulum swings, and I think it's swinging. It went way off to the left. It's now swinging to the right. And of course, everybody on the left is screaming, see Nazi. Has nothing to do with being a Nazi. It has everything to do with the survival of Western civilization and the national identities of the persons and the peoples that created it. But, for the moment, we're going to persist on this very destructive path. And I really think that Donald Trump is someone who is conflicted because he knows what I've said is true, and he believes that. But on the other hand, the people that have funded him, the people that control him, the people that transport him from point A to point B, the people that hand him his point papers or tell him something, they don't agree at all. They're on the path to destruction. And he looks at the various entities and the cabinet members. How many of those people are really responsive to him? And how many of them are responsive to others? I mean, this is a huge problem. I don't think it's unique to us, but it's very, very bad. So in the meantime, I think what he thinks in his mind is, I need to offload this Ukraine project, probably, so that I can focus on the Middle East, as though something good there could happen, which I don't think is the case.
Yeah, well, J.D. Vance stated as much, though. He said, if the Europeans want to keep fighting Russia, they can buy our weapons, but we're done. Which is, just taking me to my last short question, which is, what is it that you think will play out in Alaska? You don't seem to have very high expectations of a deal being panned out. But again, it doesn't seem like they have a deal. Usually state leaders would come in towards the end of negotiations. But when Trump said the purpose of the meeting was to understand what Russia wants, it looks like we're at step one. But what will Putin tell Trump in Alaska? Because Trump talked a lot about territorial swaps, and Zelensky would have to sign something. I didn't hear anything about restoring Ukraine's neutrality and ending NATO expansion. But what is it that Putin will tell Trump?
If you go back to the interview that Tucker Carlson conducted with President Putin, I would say almost half of that interview, maybe a little more, consisted of President Putin trying to explain to Tucker Carlson what Russia is. And it was all about Russia. Where did Russia come from? What was the ultimate origin of this state we call Russia? And who are the Russian people? And what are their interests? We have never understood our own interests. We didn't need to. We were very rich. No one really threatened us. We live on an island that lies between the Atlantic and the Pacific, with weak neighbors to the south who have spent most of their time struggling against all the forces of poverty, criminality, and misery that you could imagine. And then the people in Canada who are very similar to us and had no real incentive to attack us, and we had no real incentive to attack them. So we've lived in this insular position, very similar to Great Britain, divorced from continental Europe. So it's very hard for Americans without any background, education, experience for any length of time overseas to understand anybody else. So I'm sure that some of the time will be spent talking to President Trump by President Putin to explain Russia a little bit. But I don't know how much. The other thing is that you may have an opportunity for some discussion about opening talks in the future on nuclear weapons. And I think President Trump would be very amenable to that, would like that. He's uncomfortable with the nuclear dimension. There's talk about the Arctic. The problem is there are lots of nations like your own that have coastline with the Arctic. They have an interest in that corridor that allows ships now to pass back and forth and all the mineral wealth that's there. And so I don't think you're going to get anywhere with that unless you have an Arctic conference. Everybody sits down and tries to sort out what they want and how they want to conduct things. And I think that's what President Putin will tell President Trump if he brings it up. But I think you may come out with some sort of plan to go forward in the future and come to some sort of arrangement on nuclear weapons of various types and kinds. Specifically, by the way, back to the INF, which we very stupidly and foolishly kicked to the curb of the road. But other than that, I don't see much coming out of it. And I think President Putin has done this as a courtesy to President Trump and said, yes, we'll agree, we'll meet. But at the end of the day, other than shaking hands and smiling and agreeing to future talks, specifically on the nuclear side, I think President Trump will come out and say, look, we did the best we could. This thing has to exhaust itself. Remember, he gave this stupid analogy about kids in the schoolyard beating each other up, not understanding what the hell he was dealing with in Ukraine. But he's going to reach the conclusion this has to exhaust itself and I can't fix it. I wouldn't be surprised if he said, this is really a matter for resolution by the Europeans, which, by the way, it always was. We had no business involving ourselves in Ukraine under any circumstances. That's crazy. But we did for all the wrong reasons by all the usual suspects. So I think that's where this is probably going to go. I'll be surprised if anything else happens. Because President Trump, in his heart of hearts, is not bellicose. This is not someone who wants a war. But as I said before, the one man who was most opposed to war in 1914 was the Kaiser in Germany. But when he was offered the opportunity to stop it, he didn't do it. And that's sort of how I see President Trump. There is a lack of self-confidence because there's a lack of understanding. I mean, he was once asked, have you read the Constitution? He said, no. He said, well, you really need to read it. He said, no, I don't. I've got all these people on staff. If I have a question about it, they'll tell me what I need to know. That is not the way you run a government. And you cannot conduct foreign policy that way. And remember, he's sitting across from people who are professional diplomats and soldiers who have studied all the maps, have studied the history. They can go back and tell you what Ukraine was 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 300 years ago, 400 years ago, 500 years ago. They can tell you where the borders were and who controlled what, when, and everything else. They're steeped in this. What are we coming with? Witkoff? Now, maybe Marco Rubio, who I think probably knows a lot about Cuba and the Caribbean because he is Cuban, but I don't think he knows much about Russia. I don't think he knows much about Eastern Europe. Now, he may bring some people with him who do. We can hope. But my impression is, just as it was under Biden and previous administrations, is we have people that the British used to refer to as gifted amateurs. Have you ever heard that expression? Yeah, well, in the British Army, there was always tremendous resistance to professionalizing anything. We don't want to be like those Prussians and read those books. That's not the way. We want to be sportsmen, athletic, and outside. I'm serious. And that explains a lot of failures militarily by the British over at least the last 2 to 3 centuries. And they used to talk about, we have gifted amateurs. Someone who comes in who may not know much, but he's an organizer and he's energetic and enthusiastic, and he puts things together and gets stuff done. The gifted amateur. The British Empire was managed in many respects on the British military side by gifted amateurs. Well, you could get away with a lot in the developing world. In fact, some cases you still can. But that doesn't work in the world that we live in today, in the 21st century. You have to have professionals who understand and are studied, but you also have to listen to them. And I know that President Trump has a disinterest in long discussions on anything, and he doesn't like to read a lot of material. So is he going to show up and know anything more than he did before? Maybe a little bit. Is someone going to take him aside, Glenn, and say, look, Mr. President, Ukraine is destroyed. Millions of people are suffering. At least 1.8 million Ukrainian soldiers are dead. Are they going to tell him the truth? The most humane thing we can do is try to bring this war to a close as soon as possible. And then would you ask, if you were president, as President Trump is, well, then what should I do? What are the measures that I should adopt? What should I approach the president of Russia with? I have very serious doubts that those kinds of conversations are even happening. But as you point out, what should have happened in the background is that J.D. Vance says, well, let these Europeans sort it out. Okay, why? Because we've done everything we can. We're great. We're right. We've always done everything right. It's these damn Europeans. And I remember hearing that, by the way, in 1995 when Ambassador Holbrooke was running around at Dayton. Oh, these Europeans are a problem. We got to send them away. Great.
It's more the same. I think one of the reasons why there's so many amateurs these days, not any more professionals, is ideology, to be honest. Because in the past, you would have professionals who would speak of history and national interest, competing security interest, where you have to confront, where you can harmonize interest, what diplomacy should consist of. These days, ideology just dumps everything down to the good guys versus the bad guys, in which you can't really make compromises. Even recognizing the security concerns of your opponents is somehow immoral because you might legitimize them. I mean, we dumbed it down, I think, with this. So anyways, thank you, as always, so much for your time. I know you're busy, so yeah, thanks again.
Thank you, Glenn. That was a great formulation at the end. Thank you for saying that.